The moment Bernie Sanders let out that condescending chuckle on the congressional hearing room floor, he had no idea that Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver a line that would silence him forever. What happened in the next 30 seconds didn't just shock everyone in the room. It completely flipped the script on one of the most powerful progressive voices in America. The 82-year-old Vermont senator thought he could dismiss the young Texas congresswoman with a laugh and a wave of his hand. After all, he'd been fighting for progressive causes since before she was born. But Crockett, armed with facts he never saw coming, was about to prove that experience doesn't always beat preparation. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. This was the moment a rising star took down a political legend, and the entire progressive movement watched in stunned silence as their hero got schooled by someone half his age. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss what happens next because this story is about to get wild. The committee room was packed that Tuesday morning, cameras rolling as the heated budget hearing continued into its third hour. Sanders sat at the curved wooden table, his signature wild white hair slightly disheveled, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He'd been dominating the conversation for the past 20 minutes, his gravelly Brooklyn accent filling the room as he passionately defended his position on healthcare spending. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly, her professional navy blazer crisp against her dark skin, natural hair styled in a sleek bob that framed her determined face. At 33, she was one of the youngest members of the committee, and Sanders clearly didn't see her as a threat. That was his first mistake. The tension had been building all morning. Sanders had been pushing his Medicare for All agenda with his usual fire and brimstone approach, dismissing any opposition with sharp retorts and that familiar finger-pointing gesture that had made him famous. When other committee members tried to challenge his numbers, he'd wave them off with decades of experience and righteous indignation. But Crockett had been taking notes. Lots of notes. As Sanders wrapped up another passionate speech about the failures of the current healthcare system, he leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. The room was his, and he knew it. Committee members nodded along, some taking notes, others checking their phones. It was vintage Bernie, passionate, commanding, and completely in control. Then Crockett raised her hand. "Senator Sanders," she said, her voice cutting through the room with quiet authority. "I'd like to address some of the figures you just presented." Sanders looked up, his expression shifting from satisfaction to mild amusement. He glanced around the room, making eye contact with a few other committee members as if to say, "Here we go again, another rookie trying to challenge the master." "Of course, Congresswoman," he said, his tone dripping with the kind of condescending politeness that veteran politicians reserve for newcomers they don't take seriously. "Please, enlighten us with your perspective." And then it happened. Sanders let out a small chuckle, not loud enough to be disrespectful, but clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. It was the kind of laugh that said, "This should be entertaining," mixed with, "I've got time to humor the kid." The sound echoed off the marble walls of the hearing room, and in that moment something shifted in Crockett's eyes. The quiet determination was still there, but now it was backed by something else. A fire that Sanders was about to discover he'd lit himself. She opened her leather portfolio, pulled out a stack of papers, and looked directly at Sanders. Her next words would change everything. To understand what happened next, you need to know who these two political powerhouses really are, and why this moment mattered so much more than just another congressional disagreement. Bernie Sanders, the 82-year-old Democratic socialist from Vermont, who's been fighting the same fights for over 4 decades. He's the guy who brought progressive politics into the mainstream, who filled stadiums with young people chanting about revolution, who almost beat Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination in 2016. With his rumpled suits, wild hair, and finger-wagging passion, Bernie became the grandfather of the progressive movement. But here's what people forget about Bernie. He's also incredibly stubborn, set in his ways, and not used to being challenged by people he considers less experienced. He's been giving the same speeches about billionaires and healthcare for so long that he sometimes acts like he owns the progressive playbook. And in rooms like this one, surrounded by younger politicians, he often treats them like students rather than equals. Sanders had built his entire career on being the outsider, the truth teller, the guy who wasn't afraid to take on the establishment. His Medicare for All plan was his baby, his legacy, the policy he'd been fighting for since the 1970s. Anyone who questioned it wasn't just wrong. They were betraying the progressive cause itself. On the other side of that committee table sat Jasmine Crockett, and if Sanders had done his homework, he would have known he was about to mess with the wrong person. At 33, Crockett had already built a reputation as one of the most prepared and sharp-tongued members of Congress. A former civil rights attorney from Dallas, she'd cut her teeth fighting for justice in Texas courts before winning her seat in 2022. Unlike some politicians who rely on staff to do their research, Crockett was known for diving deep into policy details herself. She'd grown up in a working-class family in Missouri, watching her grandmother struggle with medical bills despite having insurance. Healthcare wasn't just a political issue for her, it was personal. But unlike Sanders, who approached the problem with passion and big speeches, Crockett believed in practical solutions backed by hard data. Her colleagues had learned not to underestimate her the hard way. During her first year in Congress, she'd taken down a seasoned Republican congressman during a hearing on voting rights, using his own previous statements to expose his hypocrisy. The video went viral, and suddenly everyone knew that the quiet freshman from Texas came prepared for battle. But Sanders didn't know any of this. To him, she was just another young politician who'd probably gotten lucky in a safe Democratic district. He was about to learn otherwise. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond just these two people. The progressive movement was at a crossroads. For years, Sanders had been its undisputed leader. But a new generation of progressive politicians was rising. Younger, more diverse, and sometimes more pragmatic than the Vermont senator. This wasn't just about healthcare policy. This was about the future of progressive politics. Would it continue to be dominated by Sanders's style of passionate rhetoric and broad proposals? Or would it evolve toward the more detail-oriented, practical approach that politicians like Crockett represented? The room was full of political reporters, lobbyists, and staffers who understood exactly what they were witnessing. This wasn't just another policy disagreement. This was a potential changing of the guard, playing out in real time on live television. Sanders sat there with his confident smirk, completely unaware that he was about to become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating your opponents. He'd built his career on fighting for the little guy, but he was about to learn that sometimes the little guy fights back. Crockett, meanwhile, had been waiting for this moment for months. She'd watched Sanders dominate hearing after hearing with his passionate speeches and dismissive attitude toward anyone who dared question his approach. She'd seen him wave off legitimate concerns with the kind of arrogance that comes from decades of being treated like a progressive prophet. Today, that was going to end. As she organized her papers and prepared to speak, Crockett knew that what she said next would either establish her as a serious player in progressive politics or mark her as just another politician who tried to take on Bernie Sanders and failed. The difference was, she actually had the ammunition to back up her challenge. Sanders leaned forward in his chair, that familiar combative gleam in his eyes, as he prepared to do what he'd done to countless other politicians over the years, dismantle their arguments with righteous fury and decades of experience. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice carrying that gravelly authority that had intimidated senators and presidents alike. "I've been fighting for Medicare for all since before you were born. I've been to Canada. I've seen their system work. I've studied the numbers for 40 years. He paused dramatically, letting his words sink in while adjusting his glasses, a gesture that had become as much a part of his brand as his wild hair. "Now, I'm sure you have some concerns, and that's fine. We all have concerns. But let me tell you something about the current system." And off he went into his standard speech about insurance company profits and administrative costs, speaking with the confidence of someone who'd given this exact presentation thousands of times. The other committee members started to tune out. They'd heard this before. Some checked their phones, others shuffled papers. This was just Bernie being Bernie, passionate, repetitive, and completely convinced of his own righteousness. But Crockett wasn't tuning out. She was taking more notes, and anyone watching closely would have noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Sanders was giving her exactly what she needed. "Senator," she interjected politely when he paused for breath, "I appreciate your passion, and I certainly respect your experience." Sanders nodded approvingly, clearly expecting praise or at least respectful deference to his progressive credentials. "But," Crockett continued, and that one word made Sanders' expression shift slightly, "I think we need to look at some specific numbers that might complicate your projections." Sanders waved his hand dismissively. "Numbers, numbers, numbers. Congresswoman, with all due respect, I've been looking at these numbers longer than you've been alive. The American people don't need more complicated analysis. They need health care as a human right." There was that condescending tone again, and this time it was picked up by the microphones for everyone watching to hear. Several committee members looked up from their phones, sensing that something was shifting in the room's dynamic. "I understand that perspective, Senator," Crockett replied, her voice remaining steady and professional. "But the American people also need accurate information about how we're going to pay for these programs and how they'll actually work in practice." Sanders let out a longer laugh this time, one that echoed through the hearing room. He looked around at his colleagues with an expression that clearly said, "Can you believe this kid is trying to lecture me on healthcare policy?" "Congresswoman, please," he said, still chuckling. "I think you might be overthinking this. Medicare for all is simple. We expand Medicare to cover everyone. The savings from eliminating insurance company profits alone will fund most of the program. These aren't new concepts." That's when Crockett opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of documents. The papers were organized with colored tabs, charts, and what appeared to be extensive research. Sanders's smile faltered slightly as he realized this wasn't going to be as easy as he'd expected. "Senator Sanders," Crockett said, her voice gaining strength, "I've spent the last 6 months reviewing the Congressional Budget Office analysis of your Medicare for All proposal, and I've found some significant discrepancies between your public statements and the actual projected costs." The room went quiet. This wasn't the usual passionate back and forth about philosophical approaches to healthcare. This was about to get technical, and everyone could sense it. Sanders' expression hardened. He wasn't used to being challenged on specifics, especially not by someone he clearly considered a political newcomer. His usual approach was to overwhelm opponents with passion and moral authority, not get bogged down in detailed policy analysis. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice taking on an edge, "I don't need some rookie politician telling me what the budget office says. I've been working with budget analysts since you were in elementary school." The dismissive comment hung in the air like a slap. Several committee members visibly cringed at Sanders' tone, and Crockett's professional demeanor cracked for just a moment, revealing a flash of the steel beneath. But instead of getting angry, she smiled. It was the kind of smile that should have warned Sanders he was walking into a trap, but his arrogance was too thick for him to notice. "I'm sure you have, Senator," she replied calmly, "which is why I'm so surprised by some of the statements you made just 20 minutes ago." She flipped to a specific page in her notes, and Sanders could see that it was covered in highlighted text and detailed annotations. "You stated that Medicare for All would save the average American family $3,000 per year compared to current insurance costs. You also said that the program would cost approximately $32 trillion over 10 years, which you claimed would be fully offset by eliminating insurance company overhead and negotiating prescription drug prices." Sanders nodded impatiently. "That's right. Those are the facts." "Are they?" Crockett asked quietly. The question hung in the air, and for the first time since the hearing began, Sanders looked uncertain. He wasn't used to having his facts questioned by someone who clearly had done extensive research. "What are you suggesting, Congresswoman?" he asked, his voice losing some of its confident bluster. Crockett pulled out another document, this one with official government letterhead. "Well, Senator, according to the Congressional Budget Office's most recent analysis, which was completed just last month and apparently hasn't made it into your talking points yet, the actual cost would be closer to $38 trillion over 10 years. Sanders shifted in his chair, his confident posture beginning to crack. That's within the margin of error." $6 trillion is within the margin of error, Crockett asked, raising an eyebrow while flipping through her meticulously organized notes. "Senator, that's more than the entire current annual federal budget. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between a realistic proposal and a fantasy." She paused, letting her words sink in while Sanders struggled to find a response. The other committee members were now leaning forward in their chairs, sensing that this exchange was about to become something much more significant than a routine policy discussion. "But let's put that in terms regular families can understand," Crockett continued, her voice gaining momentum. $6 trillion over 10 years means that every working family in America would pay approximately $1,800 more in taxes than you've been telling them. That's rent money for millions of families. That's college savings. That's the difference between financial security and financial stress for working people you claim to represent. The other committee members were now paying full attention. Some were frantically taking notes. Others were trying to look up the budget office report on their phones. The casual atmosphere of a routine hearing had evaporated, replaced by the tension of a real political confrontation. Sanders was starting to look flustered, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Congresswoman, you're cherry-picking numbers to attack a program that would help millions of Americans. This is exactly the kind of petty political game-playing that keeps us from making real progress." It was a classic Sanders move. When challenged on specifics, pivot to moral authority and accuse the challenger of playing politics. It had worked for him countless times before, but Crockett wasn't backing down. "Senator," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I'm not playing games. I'm trying to figure out how we're going to explain to American families why their taxes are going to be $2,000 higher per year than you promised them." Sanders's face was starting to redden. "Those numbers are preliminary." "Are they?" Crockett interrupted, pulling out yet another document. "Because according to your own office's analysis, which I obtained through a Freedom of Information request, your staff has known about these revised cost projections for 3 months. The room went dead silent. This wasn't just about policy disagreements anymore. Crockett was essentially accusing Sanders of knowingly misleading the public about the costs of his signature proposal. Sanders stared at her, his mouth slightly open. For the first time in decades, the man who'd built his career on having all the answers found himself speechless. But Crockett wasn't done. She had one more bombshell to drop, and Sanders was about to discover that his dismissive laughter had awakened something he really didn't want to deal with. The moment Bernie Sanders realized he was in serious trouble came when Jasmine Crockett pulled out a folder marked with his own Senate office letterhead. His eyes widened as he recognized the document, and for the first time in the entire hearing, his confident demeanor cracked completely. "Senator Sanders," Crockett said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who knew she held all the cards, "since you seem to think I'm just making up numbers to attack your program, let me read you something directly from your own staff's internal analysis." She opened the folder and pulled out several pages of official Senate correspondence. Sanders's face went pale as he recognized the documents. Internal communications that were supposed to be confidential, but had apparently been released through proper legal channels. "This is from a memo dated 3 months ago, written by your own chief policy advisor to your communications director," Crockett continued, her voice steady but growing in intensity. And I quote, "The senator needs to stop citing the $32 trillion figure in public appearances. Our updated analysis shows costs will exceed $38 trillion, and the tax burden on middle-class families will be significantly higher than we've been claiming." The hearing room erupted. Committee members started talking over each other, reporters frantically scribbled notes, and cameras zoomed in on Sanders' increasingly uncomfortable expression. But Crockett wasn't finished reading. The memo continues. "We're particularly concerned about the senator's claims regarding family savings. Our analysis shows that families earning between $50,000 and $100,000 annually would actually pay more under Medicare for all than they currently pay for private insurance when you factor in the required payroll taxes." Sanders tried to interrupt. "Congresswoman, internal staff discussions are taken out of context." "Out of context?" Crockett's voice rose for the first time, and the controlled fury in her tone silenced not just Sanders, but the entire room. "Senator, this isn't some casual staff discussion. This is a detailed analysis that directly contradicts every public statement you've made about your own proposal for the past year." She stood up from her chair, holding the documents in her hand like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Do you want to know what really bothers me about this, Senator Sanders?" she asked, her voice carrying a moral authority that rivaled his own. It's not that the numbers were wrong. Policy is complicated, projections change. I understand that. Sanders started to nod, perhaps thinking she was about to give him an out. What bothers me, Crockett continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, is that when I asked legitimate questions about these costs, you laughed at me. You dismissed me like I was some naive kid who didn't understand the issues. You've been doing it to other members of this committee for months. The room was completely silent now. Every person present could feel the shift in power happening in real time. But here's the thing, Senator. I did understand the issues. I did my homework. I spent months reviewing every line of budget analysis, every cost projection, every economic impact study. And what I found was that either you didn't know what your own staff was telling you, or you knew and you decided to keep misleading the American people. Sanders's face was now completely red, and his hands were visibly shaking. The man who had spent decades as the moral voice of the progressive movement was being systematically dismantled by someone half his age using his own documents. Now, Crockett said, sitting back down but maintaining her commanding presence, you have a choice. You can keep laughing at me and dismissing my concerns, or you can explain to this committee and to the American people why you've been knowingly presenting inaccurate information about a program that would fundamentally reshape our entire healthcare system. Sanders opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his political career, Bernie Sanders had been completely outmaneuvered. But Crockett still wasn't done. She had saved her biggest revelation for last. Senator, she said, pulling out one final document, there's one more thing. This memo is from your staff to several major progressive donors, explaining that you were aware of the cost discrepancies, but felt that revealing them publicly would undermine progressive momentum and provide ammunition to Republican opponents. The bombshell hit like a nuclear weapon. Sanders wasn't just guilty of having inaccurate numbers. He was guilty of deliberately concealing accurate information from the public for political reasons. So let me ask you directly, Senator Sanders, Crockett said, her voice now carrying the full weight of moral authority. How is deliberately misleading American families about the true cost of healthcare reform any different from what you've accused insurance companies of doing for decades? The comparison was devastating. Sanders had built his entire career on attacking corporate dishonesty and advocating for transparency. Now he was being accused of the same kind of deceptive practices he'd spent his life fighting against. Sanders tried one last time to regain control. Congresswoman, you're twisting internal discussions. Am I? Crockett interrupted, holding up another page. Because this email from your communications director specifically instructs staff to avoid detailed cost discussions and tour direct to morale arguments about healthcare as a right, whenever pressed on specifics. She looked directly at Sanders, her eyes blazing with the righteous indignation that he'd once monopolized. Senator, I believe healthcare is a human right. I believe we need to fix our broken system. But I also believe that American families deserve honest information about what that's going to cost them and how it's going to work. And if you can't provide that honesty, then maybe it's time for someone else to lead this fight. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The old guard versus the new. Experience versus preparation. Passion versus precision. Sanders sat there, his signature fire completely extinguished, looking every bit of his 82 years. The man who had inspired millions with his calls for political revolution had just been revolutionized himself. Committee members sat in stunned silence, many of them realizing they had just witnessed a changing of the guard in progressive politics. The era of Bernie Sanders' unquestioned leadership was ending, and Jasmine Crockett had just announced herself as a major player in whatever came next. But the most telling moment came when Sanders finally tried to respond. His voice, usually so strong and commanding, came out as barely more than a whisper. Congresswoman, he said, his earlier arrogance completely gone. I think there may have been some miscommunication between my staff and... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. For the first time anyone could remember, Bernie Sanders had been rendered speechless by an opponent who had simply come better prepared than he was. The progressive movement had a new voice, and she had just announced herself in the most dramatic way possible, by taking down the movement's longtime leader with nothing more than facts, preparation, and the courage to speak truth to power. The hearing room remained frozen in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity after Jasmine Crockett delivered her final blow. Committee members sat motionless. Reporters had stopped taking notes mid-sentence, and even the usually busy staffers had ceased their constant shuffling of papers. Bernie Sanders stared down at the table in front of him, his hands clasped together to stop their trembling. The man who had controlled the narrative of progressive politics for over a decade had just been systematically dismantled by someone he'd dismissed as a rookie. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The champion of fighting for the little guy had just been taken down by someone he'd treated as little. The committee chair, clearly sensing the historic nature of what had just occurred, carefully cleared his throat and attempted to restore some semblance of normal proceedings. "Senator Sanders," he said gently, "would you like to respond to Congresswoman Crockett's presentation?" Sanders looked up slowly, and for a moment it seemed like he might try to mount some kind of counterattack. His mouth opened slightly, and the familiar fire flickered briefly in his eyes. But then he glanced at the stack of documents in front of Crockett, his own documents, his own staff's analysis, his own words being used against him, and the fight went out of him completely. "I think," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the room, "we should probably take a recess and reconvene tomorrow to discuss these documents in more detail." It was a complete surrender. Bernie Sanders, who had never backed down from a fight in his life, was essentially asking for a timeout like an overwhelmed child. The committee chair quickly agreed, and as the hearing was gavelled to a close, the real drama began. Within minutes, the video clips were everywhere. Political reporters who had attended the hearing thinking it would be routine budget discussions found themselves with the story of the year. The footage of Sanders' dismissive laughter followed by Crockett's systematic takedown spread across social media like wildfire. The hashtag Crockett destroys Carney started trending within an hour, accompanied by countless memes and reaction videos. Progressive activists who had long considered Sanders untouchable were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their hero had been caught in what appeared to be deliberate deception. Conservative commentators, meanwhile, were having a field day. Here was proof, they argued, that even the most supposedly principled progressive politicians were just as willing to mislead the public as anyone else. Sanders's hypocrisy became a talking point on every political show in America. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from within the progressive movement itself. Younger activists, many of whom had grown frustrated with Sanders' unwillingness to evolve his positions or listen to new ideas, saw Crockett's performance as a long-overdue wake-up call. "This is what accountability looks like," wrote one prominent progressive blogger. "Bernie built his career on demanding honesty from others. It's about time someone demanded it from him." Others were more critical of Crockett, arguing that she had damaged progressive unity by attacking Sanders so publicly. "We should be fighting Republicans, not each other," complained one longtime Sanders supporter on social media. But the damage to Sanders' reputation was already done. For the first time in his career, his authenticity, his greatest political asset, was being seriously questioned. The fallout continued over the following days as more details emerged about the Sanders office's handling of the Medicare for all cost projections. Additional leaked emails showed a pattern of staff concerns about the accuracy of Sanders' public statements and his reluctance to address those concerns directly. Progressive donors began privately expressing concerns about Sanders' leadership. Several major advocacy groups quietly distanced themselves from his Medicare for all proposal, calling instead for more comprehensive analysis before moving forward. Meanwhile, Crockett found herself thrust into the national spotlight in a way she'd never experienced. Her office was flooded with interview requests from major news networks, speaking invitations from political organizations, and messages of support from progressive activists across the country. "Congresswoman Crockett did what needed to be done," said one prominent healthcare policy expert. "Progressive politics can't be based on good intentions alone. We need leaders who are willing to deal with reality, even when it's complicated." But Crockett herself seemed determined not to let the moment go to her head. In her first interview after the hearing, she was careful to emphasize that her goal wasn't to destroy Sanders personally, but to ensure that progressive policies were based on accurate information. "I have tremendous respect for Senator Sanders and everything he's accomplished," she said. "But respect can't mean blind acceptance of inaccurate information. If we're going to fight for healthcare reform, we need to do it with honest numbers and realistic expectations." The contrast with Sanders' own response was stark. The Vermont senator largely avoided media appearances in the days following the hearing, and when he did speak publicly, he seemed defensive and unfocused. The man who had once commanded attention with his passionate speeches now seemed uncertain and off balance. The political implications of the confrontation extended far beyond healthcare policy. Democratic Party leaders found themselves in the awkward position of managing what amounted to a public civil war within the progressive wing of their coalition. Some party veterans quietly expressed relief that Sanders' dominance was being challenged. "Bernie's been basically immune from criticism for years," one Democratic strategist confided privately. "Having someone willing to hold him accountable might actually strengthen the progressive movement in the long run." Others worried about the broader impact on Democratic unity heading into the next election cycle. Sanders still commanded significant loyalty among certain segments of the progressive base, and alienating his supporters could have serious electoral consequences. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the future of progressive politics itself. Crockett's systematic dismantling of Sanders' arguments represented a new approach to progressive advocacy, one based on detailed policy analysis rather than just moral passion. "What we're seeing is the emergence of a new generation of progressive leaders," explained one political scientist. "They're just as committed to transformative change as Sanders, but they're bringing a more rigorous, evidence-based approach to the work." The generational divide was becoming impossible to ignore. Sanders represented an older style of progressive politics, passionate, moral, but sometimes lacking in practical details. Crockett represented something newer, equally passionate and moral, but backed by extensive research and careful analysis. Young progressive activists began rallying around this new approach. "We can fight for justice and still do our homework," became a popular rallying cry on social media. The impact on Sanders personally was perhaps the most dramatic of all. Colleagues who had worked with him for decades described him as seeming genuinely shaken by the experience. For someone who had built his identity around being the most principled voice in American politics, being credibly accused of misleading the public was devastating. Several longtime Sanders allies privately encouraged him to consider whether it might be time to step back from his leadership role in the progressive movement. At 82, they argued, perhaps it was time to pass the torch to a new generation. But Sanders, true to his stubborn nature, showed no signs of backing down. In a statement released a week after the hearing, he doubled down on his Medicare for All proposal while acknowledging that some of the cost projections may need refinement. The statement satisfied no one. Sanders's critics saw it as an inadequate response to serious accusations of deception, while his supporters worried that he was showing weakness in the face of attacks from within his own movement. Meanwhile, Crockett continued to build momentum. Her detailed policy proposals began gaining support from other progressive politicians who had previously been reluctant to challenge Sanders's approach. Her office became a hub of activity as policy experts and progressive activists sought to align themselves with her more rigorous approach to reform. The transformation was remarkable. In the span of a single hearing, Crockett had gone from being seen as a promising but junior member of Congress to being recognized as a major force in progressive politics. But perhaps the most telling sign of how much had changed came 3 weeks after the hearing, when Sanders and Crockett found themselves at the same progressive conference in Chicago. Sanders, speaking first, delivered his standard passionate speech about economic inequality and healthcare reform. But the applause was noticeably more subdued than usual, and several times he seemed to lose his train of thought, something that had never happened in his decades of public speaking. When Crockett took the stage an hour later, the energy in the room was completely different. She delivered a detailed presentation on healthcare reform that included specific cost projections, implementation timelines, and realistic assessments of political challenges. The audience was captivated. Here was someone offering the transformative change they wanted, but with the practical details they needed to believe it was actually possible. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, and when it was over, everyone in the room understood that they had witnessed more than just a good speech. They had witnessed the future of progressive politics. As the conference ended and politicians headed back to Washington, the new reality was impossible to ignore. The progressive movement had a new leader, and she had earned her position not through years of gradual advancement, but through a single moment of brilliant preparation, meeting Bernie Sanders' overconfident dismissiveness. The era of Bernie Sanders' unquestioned progressive leadership was over. The era of Jasmine Crockett was just beginning. And it all started with a laugh that Bernie Sanders would spend the rest of his career regretting. If you found this incredible political showdown as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest political drama breakdowns. Let us know in the comments what you think about this generational shift in progressive politics. Are you Team Bernie or Team Jasmine? And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what real political accountability looks like. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode where we'll be covering the fallout from this historic confrontation and what it means for the future of American politics.